and introduce Andrew Beveridge from Beveridge Consulting. Andrew Beveridge is a psychologist and facilitator specialising in the practical science of leadership and employee engagement. Andrew has been consulting in remuneration with that should be NFP, organisations for 15 years. Andrew is the co-author of the Pro Bono Not-for-Profit Salary Survey. Andrew's presentation will cover the results and the findings in his report. I'd like to welcome Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks kindly. It's a real pleasure to be back with the group here. This is my 4th year. Put your hand up if you've heard me speak. Is this your 4th? Oh, I'm so sorry for you, but we've got another year, and we're discussing before the presentation that for those who have been involved in this survey, it comes around surprisingly quickly each year. It takes us by surprise each year. Really excited to be working through the results this year, and I think there's some important themes in there around how we can create safe and kind organisations, which it sounds a little bit odd in the context of pay. What's pay got to do with that? But as for those who have looked at the salary survey for a number of years, you'd recognise that we do delve into other areas around engagement, and this year looking at things like negative work-related stress as well. So I can see why everyone's just enjoying having some time away from their organisations based on their results here. It's nice to get away and take a deep breath. A little bit about the report itself and what it covers. And firstly, a big thank you to HLB and Anjab for continuing to sponsor the report along with Hester as well. Been great partners in this process. Also to Commonwealth Bank around this particular group coming together. So the survey itself, we cover over 1,200 individuals in the survey, a large number of chief executives, so over 300 CEO salary packages. That makes it the largest source of data around not-for-profit CEOs. It makes it one of the largest ones in terms of just CEO data generally outside the sector as well as other roles like general manager, operations and admin, a whole range of positions that we look at. And each year we try to roll that further down the organisation. So we're trying to add more and more roles and get deeper down into the organisation. Very good coverage of those senior roles and the management positions, and trying to push that further down in the organisation as well. So roles like the program and project management roles are in there as well for you to have a look at. But a question I'd ask of you as a group, and it's a genuine question, so it's not rhetorical, so you do need to listen to it, would be, why bother with a salary survey? So in your positions in different organisations, what would be some reasons why it would be helpful to benchmark salaries? I'd be interested in some thoughts. So who's brave and... Yes, right at the back.
Market relativity.
Yeah, market relativity. So you get a sense of where do we sit in the market versus our competitors. Are we well ahead, well behind, are we about right? And that's generally why organisations start to look at this path, but there's a lot more that we can do with this data as well. So once we're competitive, there's other interesting things that we can delve into, and so we're going to expand on those as we go. But we are going to talk about how you might use this report. So what are some ways that you might use it? Certainly the benchmarking and where do we sit in the market is part of that picture. But I present this graph. I recognise I presented this graph and just added bits onto the end of it for the last 2 years now. So for those who've been around, we always know it kicks off with a graph here. But the 2 lines there, which are, might be a little tricky to distinguish, but that one that's bouncing up and down there dramatically is the Consumer Price Index. We love the Consumer Price Index. It tells us that our bananas have gone up, or petrol costs a little bit more than it did the previous year. And a lot of organisations I work with still tie their salaries to the Consumer Price Index. It's usually the start of the conversation. We tie our salaries to CPI. This graph gives you a really good reason not to do that. So when you look at that, you wouldn't have wanted to be doing that in year 2000, where it was up at 6% and salaries were going up around about 3.5% to 4%. And so that darker line there that goes, it's a bit smoother, is the wage price index, which the Bureau of Stats puts out each year. That's been a depressing story for the last few years, but there has been a slight uptick. That's why I'm so upbeat this year. The wage price index, if we zoom in on those last few years from 2012 up to present day, and they're just about to release new figures there, but It's gone up for the first time in a good number of years and gone up to the exciting figure of 2.1%. That's what we're in line for in terms of wage price growth. For those who've been employed for a while, you'll look at that and go, 2.1, that sounds pretty low. I seem to remember, wasn't it like 3 or 4%? And that used to be pretty standard, that each year we'd get about 3 to 4% wage growth, and that picture has changed. We've seen that change, and I'd suspect change for an extended period of time now. We've seen that downward pattern. And if you look at the Consumer Price Index, where it sits at the moment as well, it's very close to that. So there is a sense where people in your organisations are probably feeling a little bit ripped off at the moment in terms of their pay. You're looking at things going, well, hang on, my cost of living is going up at about the same amount that my wage is going up. I'm not getting ahead here. I'm really sort of trapped. And we asked people a couple of years back on a webinar that we ran off the back of the salary survey, do people feel like they're underpaid, overpaid, or paid about right? And not surprising to hear, about 50% of people thought they were underpaid, which can't be correct. About another 50%, just under, thought they were paid about right. And there might have been 1 or 2 people on that webinar who were under the influence of something who said, no, I think I'm overpaid. It was about 3% of people thought they were overpaid. That can't be right. That can't be right. That can't reflect the reality that of the spread of salaries out there. There's got to be, for every person who's underpaid, there's got to be someone who's overpaid. But what we see in the market is people feeling like they're underpaid, and if you add to that, most people think they're pretty good at their job. If I got you to put your hand up and rate yourself out of 5 how good you are at your job, I won't get you to do that. Most people in this room are going to show me 4 or 5 fingers. They're going to go, I'm one of those people that just changes the world every day when I walk into the office. So we think we're awesome at our jobs and we think we're underpaid. That's where most people on average would sit. That's not a great combination. And so when we survey organisations, pay comes up as one of the biggest issues. You can guess what the second one is. I can save you from doing an employee survey. The other one would be communication. Communication's the other one. But there is some encouraging news from our salary survey. So this is government data, but when we look at our salary survey and we get CEOs to forecast what do they expect to be paying people in the coming year, this year, versus what they paid last year. So what sort of salary increases are they wanting to or expecting to put across the organisation? The median in that mix is 3%, so that's almost a full % higher than what we're seeing in the general market out there. Sending high, if you go up and look at the average, and the average and the median are different, but 3.4% for that. If you're in the kind of top quartile up there, 4.6% increases, so quite high compared to what we're seeing in the general market. And each of those are sitting, particularly the median, that's much more confident than CEOs were looking last year. So they were expecting about 2.5% last year, they jumped up to 3%. So we are seeing potentially, I don't want to call it too soon, but a little bit of a recovery in wage growth, that maybe some of those grumbles that people have been talking about have actually started to flow through into some salary increases. Interestingly, CEOs, I won't get you to put your hand up in the room, they've managed to outpace all of that and on average give themselves a 4% salary increase, so well played there. So sitting a little bit higher. Of course the boards help that out, so that's encouraging. Frequency of CEO reviews. So this is another interesting thing that we roll in each year, and we've actually seen improvement on this space. So this is looking at how often do CEOs receive some kind of review of their pay. It doesn't necessarily mean that the review is giving them more money, but at least someone's taken a look at it. And we've got now 59% of CEOs say that they're getting their salaries reviewed on an annual basis. To give you a sense, last year it was just over 50%. So we are actually seeing a bit of a shift here where more people are getting reviews on a more regular basis. Not enough, but more. So we've still got almost a third, 29% of people who are not getting their salaries reviewed on a regular basis in CEO positions, and I suspect that rolls down through not-for-profits a bit as well. And that's even, when we say not regular, this is not even once every 3 years. We even allow that as an option, that every 3 years we take a look at it. So I think one finding would be that I would encourage you, for those who are in board positions and for those who are CEOs, you might want to just drop that sheet on a table somewhere when you go into your next board meeting. the infrequency of those reviews actually does have an impact. It really does send a message. Maybe pay isn't the driver for that CEO, but I do just keep in the back of your mind that it has to have an impact. It sends a message around, look, we're actually not valuing that, we're not keeping pace, we're just going to let things kind of slide. And if you're doing that 2 or 3% every year, that can get out of step pretty quickly. One of the other key things, when we're using these salary surveys, we do need to look at the results by organisational size. And so we find this picture each year, and I've presented it again. I've erased some of the figures there, but for those who've got good eyesight, they might be able to see some of them just to give a bit of a sense of the range and an appetite for the salary survey there. But as we look at increasing size of organisation, this is for CEO roles, so we're starting at smaller organisations with a turnover less than $500,000 up to some that are over 50 million turnover in revenue. You see this lovely kind of pattern, and psychologists get excited about these patterns because it goes, well, this is great. We can put this up in a presentation and people get as excited as I do about seeing that kind of growth picture there. It means that if you're running a larger organisation, on average you'll tend to get paid more than if you're running a smaller organisation. So that works for CEOs on revenue. It actually works, this one's based on number of employees. We see exactly the same kind of pattern, that as the number of employees goes up, you tend to find the average salaries go up for CEOs. And you go, well, that makes sense for a CEO. But it is something that we strongly encourage when you're benchmarking your salaries. You look at this not just for CEOs, but for other positions as well. So even when you get further down the organisation, this is for project managers. And you would think project managers, so they're sitting like 2 or 3 levels down, you still see, not as aggressive, but you still see the same kind of pattern of growth based on the size of organisation. So if you want to get paid more on average in the not-for-profit sector, go for somewhere that's got lots of people working there or has a larger budget. That will tend to help you out. But it does reinforce that if you sit somewhere in this range, it's helpful to know, well, who am I competing against? And so having this ability to break it down by these levels actually makes quite a difference. The other thing I'd say, if you don't entirely switch off at the mention of the word percentile or quartile, is that being able to split the market by different points in the market is really critical. And so we do that on the salary survey as well. We look at what's happening in the lower quartile, at the midpoint of the market, at the upper quartile as well. And so a good starting point for your organisation is to say, how do we compare against the midpoint of the market? Are we kind of on track with that? Some organisations say we actually want to kind of benchmark ourselves a bit higher for whatever reason that might be. Maybe it's a bit more, got a bit more money to throw around, or it's harder to attract people, so we want to pay a bit more. So having that data will make a big difference as well. One thing that is increasingly coming up, in fact it's come up twice in the last week just with a couple of different organisations, is the use of incentives in the not-for-profit sector. I know, gasp, because it seems on the surface that incentives and not-for-profits don't really sit together. We're not investment bankers, Andrew. We're just trying to, run a not-for-profit here. Why would we look at incentives? Now, the use of incentives is still relatively limited within the sector, but definitely much more on the table for boards and exec teams as they're thinking about dealing with that challenge of limited wage growth. But also, when we're talking about a safe and a nice environment, much more of a focus on being productive. Again, a shocking finding, but your funders are probably giving you maybe a little less money than they used to, or they're being a bit tighter in terms of how they're going to measure the impact of what you're doing. So they're looking at it very closely going, what are you actually delivering here? We're going to really stipulate how many staff we want working on this particular contract, and we're going to kind of tighten it up. So a lot of organisations are trying to do more with less. That's probably a theme for not-for-profits over the last few years. And incentives really provide an opportunity to think about, well, how productive are people being and how do we recognise that, or at least focus people's attention on that. If you look at the availability of incentives in the sector versus the general market, and so I'll give you some general market data here as well. The availability is at left. Our data would suggest about 16% of CEOs received some kind of financial incentive in the last year. We're starting to see a bit of an increase over time in that, so a bit more appetite for the use of incentives. Interestingly, if you go out into the general market and you look at CEOs in the general market, and this is not just listed companies, this is CEOs generally, about 44% of CEOs in the general market would be getting incentives. So it's pretty common. About half would be having some kind of financial incentive. So a bit lower in the not-for-profit sector. And interestingly, the amounts on the table tend to be lower in the not-for-profit sector. So CEOs, on average, about 5% of their package would be an incentive payment. And that's the 5% for the 16% who get it. Okay, so that's the amount there, versus in the general market up around 16%. And so we're seeing, while those numbers are relatively low, there are things that we can do to start to incentivise our staff or focus them in on what's really important for our organisation. Now, I have, in working with different organisations, I've probably recommended against incentives as often as I recommend for them. So it's not something that I just kind of roll out as a, you must do this. The other part, though, is thinking about some of the challenges in the sector, and so I'm going to spend the remaining time talking about what are some of the tough things that we're facing and what might we do to actually start addressing some of those as well. So not just present the problems, but what we might do with them. So as part of the salary survey, we had just over 1,000 leaders who responded to questions around things like their level of engagement, the extent to which they're feeling their jobs are demanding, the extent to which they're experiencing negative work-related stress. Now, as a psychologist, I have to apologise because we have spent, as a profession, a good number of years telling people that stress is really, really bad and you need to avoid it. That's not actually correct. Stress is not the thing that will kill you. It's the ongoing, relentless, no break that's going to get you. Actually, stress is something that stretches people. It's good to be under pressure and to push yourself. It's when you don't have that ability to step back and recover from that, that's what's going to get you. And that's why we worded the questions around negative work-related stress. This is stuff that you look at and go, look, I'd much rather avoid this. It's the kind of stuff that keeps you up in the middle of the night. So of the over 1,000 leaders that filled out those questions, 30% were CEOs, 45% were direct reports to CEOs, so these are senior not-for-profit people. Here are the challenges. I feel like we need a drum roll here, but I'll do that myself. There we go. So about 58% feel their pay is reasonable. That leaves us with a fair chunk of people who are looking at it going, you know what, I don't think my pay is right. It doesn't seem it's competitive enough. That marries up hauntingly close to that about half of people who feel underpaid. 82% of leaders feel their work is demanding. Now, of that, there was quite a big chunk of that really strongly agreed with that one. They used the upper end of that rating scale to go, yeah, it's really, really demanding. So feeling like the pressure is on, I think that doing more with less is a theme that's coming through. We've got almost half, 46%, so they often experience negative work-related stress. So this is just kind of my normal week, is that part of that's going to be I'm feeling a bit sick about work, or I'm not feeling like I can engage and really connect. Interestingly, negative work-related stress increases with job demands. It's one of those other graphs I get excited about. As a psychologist, almost a straight line. So as my job gets more demanding, on average, I tend to experience more negative work-related stress. So that's kind of interesting, but what we started to look at is, well, what are the exceptions to that? Are there people who are in really demanding jobs who actually feel all right about it and don't have the negative work-related stress, and what is it about them that's different? Because maybe we can learn something from that, so I'll get to that shortly. Some of the potential impact of that, we've got 17% of people who said they're not sure if they'd like to continue working where they are for the next 12 months. So I'll let that sink in. 17% going, I'm not sure this is the place for me, and this is just 12 months. This isn't like, we're not signing up for life here. I'm just saying, do you want to be here in a year? We've got a big chunk of people who go, I'm not sure. Now, if that translates into people actually moving, that's pretty high level of turnover for senior roles, and something that would be quite concerning, I'd say, for a lot of organisations. Now, if we think about, well, that's great. So some of my staff are feeling a bit stressed, well, that's a shame, but let's just keep working. This is the real world. We actually looked at, well, what's the impact of that? What impact does that have on people? And looked at that particularly around aspects of employee engagement. And so what we found is that the likelihood of staying with the organisation for those who are experiencing stress regularly was 20% lower. So they're going to stay less long. If that's great grammar. So less longer. You can quote me on that one. Put that, got the camera rolling there, Kim. Okay, so likelihood of staying is reduced. The other thing that we find is willingness to recommend the organisation as a place to work is 20% lower as well. And these are senior people. So we've got like CEOs, general managers going, you know what, this isn't the place for you to work. Largely impacted on by that negative stress. That's the thing that's starting to drive and impact that. Job satisfaction, not surprisingly, 19% lower. Motivation to do their best work, 13% lower. Pride in the organisation, 13% lower. And willingness to even recommend the services of the organisation being 9% lower. So they're not even talking positively about the stuff that we do, let alone, you know, you don't want to work here because it's such a stress factory that we've produced here. So this has a real business impact. It's not just a nice thing to do, to create an environment where people feel motivated and engaged and where they're not going home and finding it difficult to get off to sleep each night. So through the research we discovered 5 areas that you can focus on to improve these. So to round out the presentation and not make it too doom and gloom, because there is some good stuff in here, there are things that we can do to turn this around. And what we actually looked at were those people who said, I've got the highest work demands. So we looked at the people who are really going, you know what, this is really, really challenging. Because I think that challenge is important. If you look at what motivates people, actually, giving a sense of achievement and stretch is important. We don't want just kind of cushy environments where I'm not being challenged. So that job challenge is important, but how can we buffer people against the negative impact of negative work-related stress and in fact reduce those stress levels as well? So looking at those who had the highest job demands, what we found is building a sense of purpose is number 1. If you have come to last year's presentation, you would have heard something around building purpose being important, around engaging people as well. And it is almost not a silver bullet, but it is something that if you haven't tried it, linking people to the purpose of your organisation and giving them a clear sense of what's my job in getting there is absolutely crucial. As not-for-profits, we often spend a lot of money, time, effort on how we present ourselves out to the market. You know, why is this a great organisation? Why is this a place where you want to give us some additional funds so that we can do our good work? This is really taking that same approach and focusing it inward and saying, well, what's that mean for you? How do you as an individual be a part of that bigger picture? So building a sense of purpose, having an organisation where you feel that you can have a positive impact on that. For people who do agree that they've got a sense of purpose in their organisation versus those who are neutral or negative, 31% lower in terms of their ratings of negative work-related stress. So that is, if you had a pharmaceutical that could generate that result, you'd be selling it, selling like hotcakes. Again, don't quote me on that, it's probably not the takeaway quote. But in terms of being able to reduce negative stress while also increasing engagement. So you've got people who are feeling like my job's demanding, but I'm actually not that stressed in a negative way. In fact, I'm pretty engaged with the place. This is a good place to work. We're doing great work here. I want to stay. I speak positively about it. In fact, why don't you come work for us? That's what engagement looks like in practice. And we see that their likelihood of staying is 87% higher than those who would say the purpose is a bit bland or actively I don't think we have a very good, I don't have a connection really to our purpose here. So how do you generate that? I think part of that picture is we can do it at an organisation-wide level, but people managers are critical in that picture. So people managers are in a position where they can say, for you in this job, I'm going to help you to understand that link between where we're headed and what your role is in that. So people managers, I think, are the undersung heroes in this story as we go through. Secondly, support ongoing development. Part of your brain has gone to more training courses, so just get rid of that part. It's not necessarily more training courses. This is about getting better at something that matters to me. And if we can create environments where people feel like they can get better at things that matter to them and develop skills that are important to them, it's not just good for their engagement and staying, and again, quite high figures there, so 60% higher in engagement, 87% higher in terms of their likelihood of staying, but reducing that negative stress again by 26%. So quite dramatic turnarounds in terms of the impact it has, not just on the good stuff, but reducing the bad stuff as well. Third area was encouraging connections. And working in the sector, you know this stuff. You know, why does Meals on Wheels work? It's part nutrition, but it's part a human being came into my house, you know, said hello, checked on me, you know, patted me on the back, asked how my day was and gave me a meal. I mean, it's the connections that actually make a big difference. And for you know, just scanning the room and the kind of organisations we have here, you probably know that's the secret sauce in a lot of the work that you do. It's not just the advice you give or the equipment you provide. It's creating connections for people who often might feel quite isolated and alone. And I'll give you a news flash on that. That's a lot more people than it used to be. So on average, people are feeling pretty isolated and alone. We've got a bit of a deficit on connections. So as an organisation, if we can create an environment where people feel more connected, which might be social activities, but it might be things like working across the organisation in other divisions, then that's going to make a big difference. In fact, what we saw, reductions again in negative stress of around 20% there, increases in engagement and likelihood to stay. So if you're going to try something, it would be how do we connect people across teams? Because we know if you go, well, let's all go bowling, probably what will happen is 20% of people won't want to go bowling. The other 80% who turn up are just going to hang around with the people they normally hang around with. So doing something that proactively mixes people across the organisation, gives them a sense of, oh, these aren't the bad people from upstairs, they're actually quite nice people and we've got things in common. Anything that can build those connections will make a difference. And it's not just a nice thing to do, it doesn't just reduce their stress levels and give them some further supports. It actually is you're going to get something out of it because they're going to be more motivated around their work. Building greater autonomy, and this is a classic one in terms of motivating people, but again we've seen that it helps out on negative work-related stress. So having leaders who can delegate well makes a big difference, and that is it's quite difficult for people to do that. They actually need some support and training, encouragement, coaching and mentoring around how do you delegate well in the not-for-profit sector. In a way that kind of doesn't feel like we're pushing people around, that we're actually equipping people. And interestingly enough, leaders who delegate well, often their staff members will feel like, you know, I'm learning new things. It's not just my boss is kind of palming stuff off on me, but this is actually good, getting to do some more interesting things. So that can lead into one of the earlier points we said as well. The fifth one, and by no means the least, is around structuring pay. So people who feel like their pay is reasonable compared to other organisations, even when their job is demanding, that alone is associated with lower levels of negative work-related stress, interestingly enough. Now, we haven't combined all of these things. They don't all add up. So I think if you added those numbers up together, it would be over 100%, and you'd be, I don't know what you'd be at that point, you'd be asleep or something in terms of your stress levels. So it doesn't quite work that way, but there's no reason why you can't combine some of these things together. And I think the key thing with reward and structuring pay is to give your leaders confidence in addressing what we know is a common complaint. You know, my pay's not fair. If you can have a 3-minute conversation around the lengths that your organisation goes to address that and make sure it is fair, that will help address a lot of that issue. It's always, the reality is, it's always going to be a bit of a gripe. I think we're never going to quite get that 50% of people who feel overpaid. We're never going to quite shift them, but if we can get people to kind of at least go, look, these people are trying to benchmark it, they're trying to look somewhere else, they haven't left it for 7 years, that's going to make a difference. And we see that it has a difference not just in reducing stress, but in encouraging people to stay and also engage with the workplace as well. So the salary survey goes into some of that research, gives you the numbers as well. There's a lot of things that you can kind of dip into from different angles. And my interest is I'll be honest, is less in the dollars and cents. I think it's important information to have, but it's important because it does help to engage and motivate people. If you can kind of get it out of the way as an issue and get into some of these other interesting things, that's going to play an important role for your organisation as well. So just a few links, and I believe you can have access to the presentation post this as well, so they'll get distributed around to you. So the salary survey, you can purchase that online. It's really easy to do. I'm sure Karen will get excited if you do that. Really, so that's $249 is the price on that. It's actually pretty cheap. Genuinely, I think, and I don't work for Pro Bono Australia, sort of consulting around this project. I think it genuinely offers a lot of value for what you, if this helps you to benchmark your salaries, then that $249 will pay itself off pretty quickly. But a big thanks to HLB man Judd and Hester as well around the sponsorship. I really appreciate it. It's been always a joy to meet some of you guys in the industry as well and work with you. So thanks very much for your attention on that.